Hello. You guys got fucking lucky. So, originally, today was only going to be one video, but my friend Dio, that I was going to do stuff with, had to bail. So, you guys have gotten very lucky, and you get another video. Mainly because I woke up so early and I still have tea. May as well. Anyway, this is chapter 12 of I Borrowed a Cat's Paws. Remember, if you want to recommend me fics of any kind, one-shots, other stuff, or even other fandoms, even though they're less likely for me to podfic, I may read them and may like them, then try to ask, put them into my recommendation post. Anyway, oh, okay, there goes another Discord notification. Anyway, I will get to the chapter now. Shota woke up confused. Oh, he knew where he was and what was happening. That sort of situal awareness was life or death in this line of work, in his line of work. Shota only lost track of himself if he had a nasty concussion or drugs were in his system. No, he was mostly confused at the bright sunlight seeping through the comforter he was curled under, warming the space around him and setting everything aglow. It had only been a little after midnight, around 1 in the morning, when Dobby had shown up for his nightly ice and mittens run. Even if the subsequential chaos had taken the hours it felt like, Dobby should have recovered enough to return to bed, long before the sun rose enough to light the room up like this. Even if Dobby had elected to stay up, though, Shota shouldn't have slept this long. In such an insecure position, Shota's paranoid hero instinct should have woken him up as soon as he was well rested enough to fight. Shota blinked blearily, dragging himself out from underneath the comforter. The room was empty aside from him, the window shutters hanging open and letting sunlight fill the space. And the other two beds were rumpled and slept in. But Shota couldn't tell if it had been recent or was just left over from before Dobby's quark meltdown. Shota's spine curved, and he arched up to stretch like only a cat could, his claws flexing and his jaw cracking. With the force of his yawn. The door was cracked open, and Shota easily slipped through it, padding down the hallway to poke his head into the living room. The living room was completely packed. Toga's head was tipped over the arm of the couch. Shigaraki was curled up in his recliner with his video game. Kurogiri hovered over something on the stove, and Magne and Twice sat side by side on the love seat, the former with a book and the latter with his phone. Spinner was at the bar top, his head buried in his crossed arms. Mr. Capress had his laptop open on the table, and Dobby was sitting next to him with his back to Shota, both of them leaning over the screen. Demon! Toga was the first to see Shota. Her whole face lit up with delight. Shota suppressed a groan. He'd thought she'd gotten over him. What more did he need to do? Actually claw her eyes out? Everyone in the room turned to Shota at Toga's cry. Even Shigaraki looked up from his game, and Dabi twisted around in his chair. Are you quite well, Demon? Kurogiri asked almost gently. Shota stared at him, stunned. Yesterday, Kurogiri had been barely civil to Shota. Now he was concerned? With Shota's well-being? With Dabi, who had just had a quirk-induced meltdown that might well have been lethal without proper treatment, sitting right there? Demon? Dobby asked, and he sounded bad. Even worse than his usual slightly husky voice. He sounded like he's just smoked an entire pack of cigarettes and followed it up with screaming at the top of his lungs for an hour straight, which wasn't far off. That was about how Shota's throat felt at the moment, too. Shota wouldn't be surprised if they were both hacking up black slime for a few days. Them and Kuragiri, the provided the mist man even had lungs. Why are you still awake? Shota muttered, slinking into the room with flattened ears. He never liked attention. The only time he wanted the whole room looking at him was when he was teaching, and at least then he had a lesson plan and wasn't going in completely blind. Also, he was allowed to give them detention. Shota did his best to ignore the eyes on him, crossing the room to his water d- dish beside the bar. It had clearly been refilled recently, with cantaloupe water if wasn't mistaken, and it felt like heaven on his sore throat. Everyone was still looking at him. What do you want? Shota demanded, his tail lashing as he swept the gaze around the room. Are you sure he was actually trying to save my life? Dobby asked skeptically. There is no other explanation, Kuragiri said firmly. Without Demon, you may well have burnt to death before any one of us could think clearly enough to help you. A heavy silence settled over the room. Shota twitched his ear and awkwardly broke eye contact with Dobby, wishing he had his capture weapon to hide his face in. Hell of a way to go, Dobby said finally, then immediately dissolved into a coughing fit. Shota would have furrowed his eyebrows if he had any. Instead, the skin around his eyes tightened with worry, and he left his water dish behind to jump up onto the table. Mr. Compress would completely still as Shota approached. But Dobby was too busy dragging in desperate lungfuls of air to notice. His breathing was rough, hoarse, and rasping. And when Shota pressed his ear to Dobby's chest, he could pick up wheezing and maybe some crackling sounds. Shota frowned, twitching his ear and trying to somehow listen harder. Smoke inhalation was the most likely answer, and the preferred one, but secondary drowning was also a worrying possibility. Without good medical care, a bad case of secondary drowning could be just as deadly as the initial meltdown. Uh. Dobby had finally stopped gasping for breath and was instead staring down at Shota. Shota pulled his head away from Dobby's chest to fix him with a judgmental look. He replaced his ear with his paw on Dobby's chest and started making loud, exaggerated breathing sounds. Take a deep breath, Dobby, Mr. Compress instructed. Shota had his head pressed against Dobby's chest again in an instant, listening to his breath rush through his lungs. His tail twitched with concentration, and he flattened his other ear to his skull to try and dampen external sounds. It didn't quite sound like crackling, bubbling self-preparations that would point towards secondary drowning, but more like the low rumble from smoke inhalation. Finally, Shota pulled back with a huff, deeming it probably fine for the time being. Did the cat just check my breathing? Dobby asked, and there was a stunned disbelief under the rasp in his voice. It appears he did, Mr. Compress said thoughtfully. Shota flicked an ear at him irritably. Of course he checked Dobby's breathing. Nobody else was going to do it, and it was important to watch out for secondary drowning, especially when it might be compounded with smoke inhalation. That cat's too smart, Shigaraki grumbled, finally turning back to his video game. Shota snorted, jumping down from the table to return to his water dish. You have no idea. The next several days, Shota spent watching, mostly watching Dobby, monitoring him for signs of his smoke inhalation or possibly secondary drowning getting worse. It was interesting to see how the man acted without the constant stress of a quirk-induced meltdown looming over him at all times. Shota wouldn't say Dobby was a different person. He still took shots at Shigaraki and cackled like a hyena when someone else had a minor misfortune. He still cursed at Spinner when he thoroughly trumped everyone else at the racing game and tossed back hot coffee like it was water, but he went about it differently. His barbs were more a habit than anything else, casual and almost light-hearted, instead of actually intended to hurt. His laughter was the same, but his litany of curses steered clear of causing actual offense. More and more, he reminded Shota of Bakugo. It was a dangerous connection to make. That sort of mental connection would color Shota's impression of both Bakugo and Dabi, predispositioning him to be tougher on the former and more lenient on the latter. Not really that he could get much tougher on Bakugo, short of expelling him, which he couldn't really do anymore, not with the League already having shown an interest in recruiting him. There wasn't much Shota could do that he wasn't already. If Dobby had Bakugo's prickly, shout to keep the haters out mentality, he also undoubtedly, had Todoroki's bone-dry sarcasm. Shota had noticed it before, but now that Dobby's temper wasn't constantly running on rage-fueled cylinders, it was 10 times less as evident. He'd say the most insane things with a completely straight face, not laughing, even after the rest of the league laughed themselves to tears. With proper emotional regulation, he also had a killer poker face. Even Shota was sometimes hard pressed to figure out if he was bluffing. But Dobby wasn't the only one to change. Most of the changes were direct consequences of Dobby's shift in personality. Fewer hurtful barbs were thrown in general. Once people weren't angry and hurt, more laughter was shared than when it wasn't cruel. Some of it, though, Shota had no idea how to interpret it. The League members were still wary of Shota, but they didn't get too close to his claws or try to touch him. But they seemed less hostile. They offered him smiles and good mornings at Cantaloupe Water. The name Demon became less of a completely accurate description and more of an affectionate nickname, like Little Bastard before her name had been updated. Dabby especially seemed to have completely flipped the script. He went from wanting to torch Shota on sight to sharing bits of his own food with him. Dobby had slipped an entire strip of bacon under the table the day after his meltdown, and Shota almost wanted to test him for mind control. It was probably just the personality adjustment from suddenly no longer being under constant stress, but still, as a more helpful sign to his recovery, Dobby had stopped emerging in the middle of the night to eat ice. That was a good sign, at least for the moment. Shota hadn't been able to use the extra alone time to do anything useful, especially since, even with Dobby sleeping through the night, that left 6 other insomniacs to interrupt Shota's sleep schedule. But at the very least, it meant Dobby wasn't going to spontaneously combust anytime soon, which only increased Shota's concern with around 1 in the morning, the living room door swung silently open, and Dobby stepped through. "We've got to stop meeting like this," Shota grumbled under his breath, watching Dobby pad silently into the room. He headed directly for the couch, dropping into the cushions like a puppet with its strings cut. Shota flicked an ear at him, watching Dobby fling an arm over his eyes. He was shaking slightly, his shoulders trembling and the skin around his eyes tight. A tear ran down his cheek and caught on a staple. It wasn't more meltdown symptoms. Those took months of constant quirk use to build up. It was something much more mundane. Nightmares. With a heavy-hearted sigh, Shota uncurled from his perfect cat croissant and stood into a stretch, his tail poofing out and his claws flexing. He jumped down onto the floor and padded across the room. It jumped up onto the couch next to Dobby. Dobby let out a wet laugh, fairly louder than a whisper. It pulled his arm away to look down at Shota. "Hey there, demon," Dobby whispered, and his voice was raspy with tears rather than smoke. Shota reminded himself that he was never, ever, under any circumstances going to tell anyone that he had been turned into a cat, especially not the League of Villains. Then he crept forward to butt his head against Dobby's hand. Dobby's fingers curled around Shota's throat, and he almost held his breath, forcing himself to lean into the touch. Dobby sniffled, then sobbed, the sound retching itself out of his throat. He covered his mouth with the hand not resting on Shota's back. "I almost died." Dobby shuddered. His breath was coming too fast and hoarse, almost whistling in his throat. "I almost died, and I can't even remember." Still, Dobby didn't make a sound louder than a whisper. It took a lot of practice to have a complete mental breakdown this quietly. Shota knew that much from experience. That sort of conditioning certainly hadn't come from the League. At least not the parts of it Shota had seen. Dobby had only joined a few months ago at most. Between the USJ attack and the attack on the summer training camp, even if All for One's presidents had necessitated this kind of skill, this kind of silent, hidden breakdown, it would have taken longer than that for it to stick like this. If Shota ever figured out where Dobby had been before he'd shown up out of the blue to join the League of Villains, they were going to get a visit from a very unhappy pro. Shota caught that thought as it passed through his head, but he didn't have the time to examine it at the moment, and instead tucked it into the back of his head to pick apart later. At the moment, Shota was focused on comforting Dobby, who was shaking with silent sobs. What had his life come to? Dobby had his wrist in his mouth. Teeth clamped down on his skin and tearing staples out of his scars. Shota stepped up to Dobby's legs to bat hurriedly at his mouth. Dobby made a little noise, yanking his hand out of his mouth to stare at Shota wide-eyed. Why are you being nice to me? Dobby rasped. Why did you help me? I tried to kill you. You're supposed to be smart. You should hate me. You should. Why do you care? Why am I even talking to you? You're a cat. Dobby was falling apart at the seams, mentally, that is. Shota was almost ashamed of himself. He should have seen this coming. He desperately wished that Dobby had someone, anyone else to talk to, someone who could actually respond, who Dobby knew actually understood him, a real person. But it was unlikely that Dobby would be saying this if he knew was a person Shota was a person in cat form. Shota had been there once, when it seemed easier to keep his secrets, where he would have been a million times more likely to confide in a cat, even a highly intelligent cat, than any person. All Shota could do at the moment was offer whatever comfort he could. Shota pushed his head against Dobby's cheek, propping his front paws on Dobby's shoulders to reach above his scars. Dobby's arms abruptly snapped shut around him, clamping Shota to his chest like a vice. Shota let out a startled rip, but didn't resist, tucking his paws close to his chest as Dobby buried his face in Shota's fur. This was fine. He was fine. Shockingly enough, this was not the first time an over-emotional villain had forcefully cuddled Shota. That had been a weird night. At least this time, Shota wasn't bleeding from several places and nursing a fractured wrist. Shota flicked his tail awkwardly, but let Dobby continue to sob into his fur. He was almost scarily quiet. The only sign that he was crying, the shuddering convulsions and the slowly growing damp patch in Chota's fur. I don't want to do this, Dobby whispered between sobs. I don't want to be here. I don't want this. Why am I so angry? Why am I so angry, demon? Dobby pulled Shota away from his chest, and Shota stared at him wide-eyed. You don't even care, Dobby snarled, suddenly angry. The fire flared to life, tracing up his arm. Shota saw it coming, saw the sparks festering in Dobby's scars, and didn't even twitch when the shadows turned flaming azure. Dobby wasn't actually angry. He was scared. Scared, confused, and lashing out at everything around him, like a cornered prey animal. There were a lot of things about Dobby's perpetual pre-meltdown that Shota had only suspected. He was pretty sure it had made Dobby's scars hurt more than usual. It was likely it had made it harder or even painful to breathe deeply. It might even have made Dobby non-scarred skin hypersensitive. What Shota didn't what Shota knew for a fact was that it ramped up his negative emotions. Anything that would make him want to vent flames. It didn't work though, and Shota suspected that Dobby didn't use his emotions, and therefore stockpiled heat from previous quirk uses to fuel the angry flames. Cremation clearly required a lot of effort and concentration to use without burning things he didn't intend to. So Dobby never fueled his fire with emotions, only his emotions with his fire, which meant this that Without the constant simmering heat of a pre-meltdown, Dobby's anger burned short and cold. The fire was still fire, and it was hot, hot enough to dry Shota's fur out in only a few seconds, and make him clench his eyes shut to protect them from the heat. But the anger and the fire barely lasted a blink. Shota's skin tingled under his fur, but once the fire was gone, he stared up at Dobby with a neutral expression. "You're something else, demon." Dobby sighed, settling a hand on Shota's head. It squished Shota's ears to the side, but Shota found he didn't actually mind a whole lot. It didn't hurt, just felt a little unusual. And at least Dobby wasn't crying anymore. "You have no idea." Shota sighed back. That made Dobby's lips quirk upwards in a tired, bitter smile. A thin trickle of blood leaked from one of his staples, and Shota's own scars ached in sympathy. "You're so soft," Dobby marveled, slowly rubbing his hand over Shota's ears. Oh yeah, he had no idea how to pet cats. Had he never pet a cat before? It honestly reminded Shota once again of Todoroki. Once Shota had overheard the self-proclaimed Izukru giving Todoroki a crash course on petting small creatures, including cats, dogs, rabbits, birds, and a couple types of reptile, and hedgehogs for some reason. Midoriya had even brought in Koda to provide an object lesson. Shota had never been jealous of a student before, but when it was remarked upon, the cat seemed to like Todoroki a lot. Since his left side was warm, he'd come very close. Now, though, Shota thought he understood the cat's perspective, at least. Dobby's fingers were warm, not like going to burn you hot, or even potentially overheating warm, just warm. Like sunshine given physical form. Shota considered retreating from the contact now that Dobby wasn't at risk of having a mental breakdown alone anymore. But honestly, he'd come this far. Might as well go all in. And besides, there had been a huge number of studies about how beneficial the sound of a cat's purring could be for mental and physical health. Now Shota just had to figure out how to purr. As with a lot of naturally feline things, Shota found that he couldn't really do it if he thought about it too hard. But when he prodded his cat brain with the idea of comforting a sad kitten, his throat immediately started vibrating. It was a bizarre feeling. He was using muscles he knew for a fact humans didn't have. And the sensation was somewhere between talking, humming, and whispering. "You're vibrating," Davi observed blankly. Then with real concern in his voice he added, "Is that supposed to happen?" Shota had never heard something that tragic before in his life. He purred harder, pressing his hand into Dobby's hand. "I hope that's supposed to happen," Dobby whispered, and returned to carefully patting Shota's head. Cats, as it turned out, did have a natural instinct for purr and make the human pet you. So Shota could lean on his cat brain for that, and focus his human brain for other, more pressing things. Like how to get Dobby some real therapy. As much as Shota loved cats, even he had to admit that therapy could not be replaced by cuddles. Dobby needed to have some long talks with a quirk therapist, probably several appointments with a physical therapist, and undoubtedly some psychological help. Since Dobby was a wanted villain, that would be tricky to pull off. Although Dobby had said that he didn't want to do this. And Shota suspected that a lot of the mindset that drove him to be a real villain was actually just enhanced negative emotions he didn't know how to deal with. Maybe he could convince Dobby to leave his villainy behind. That would probably entail getting consequences for whoever had hurt Dobby enough to drive him to such an extreme measure. Although, honestly, Shota was eager to do that anyway, which led to the part of his own mental conversation that Shota didn't want to think about. Apparently, all it took was 2 weeks and a near-death experience for a wanted villain to worm his way into the group of people that Shota considered his people. Not quite the same level as Hazashi, Namuri, or Tensei were his, but on par with his students. After all, Dabi was exactly right age to be one of Shota's graduated students. He had the power level and cocky attitude of a rookie hero, but the capability for realism and of someone who had graduated from Shota's class. All he was missing was the self-sacrificial tendency that all of Shota's students inherited from him, no matter how hard he tried to convince them to be selfish about their own lives. Shota sighed over his purring, tipping his head against Dobby's shoulder like he mentally berated himself. He really did get attached too easily. If he wasn't careful, he'd end up adopting the entire league before he found a way out. That's the end of the chapter. God. I probably was pushing it here recording this, but not really. My throat feels a little strained, but honestly, it's probably because I'm catching the cold that's right around my house slightly. But anyway, I think that's all for now. Remember to check if my brain can compute, check the description for all the other stuff. Remember to check my posts to recommend fics. And, oh wait, I should say a story, because I keep forgetting the story time stuff. So, when I was younger, I don't remember how old I was, but I had invited some people to a birthday party of mine. Me and a friend had similar birthday times, so we kind of just did the same birthday day. But I don't think this one was that birthday. But I had invited some people from school. Okay? Not everyone and not all of them. Now, there was this kid that had come to my birthday party that I was pretty damn sure I never invited. He was nice though, he brought a gift, but I don't think I ever invited this dude. But he just appeared at my birthday party. This kid, I knew his name, and I knew. Okay, the reason why it matters that I knew his name is I have shit memory. If I know somebody's name, it means I at least thought something was memorable enough to commit it to memory. And I know why I've committed to memory. First, he broke into my birthday party, and then I think the last year of middle school, he fucking jumped the fence and escaped school. We're talking about the fence near the basketball court. This thing was at least 8 feet tall. He scaled the shit and booked it. I didn't get to witness this beautiful, beautiful thing, but I did get to hear the stories from it. I was the kid that knew all the gossip around school. Okay. Um, this was the reason I knew all the gossip in middle school was because one, all the teachers just knew I wouldn't be a fucking snitch or just like blab on rumor wise, which they were right. I never said rumors. I only said what the hell I found to my friend, and me and her were both similar. Um, And she was actually the principal's daughter. So I got to hear a lot of shit that I was not supposed to. I also got really lucky and unlucky. So I have so many weird stories. Most of my stories are from my middle school. That school was full of shit. Like I got to hear all of it. I can ask my friend too for some stories. Honestly, I should because God, that school was interesting. Anyway, I think that's enough from me. Bye. Actually, I'm stupid. I forgot. I didn't mention why this was notable with the. I didn't mention the rumors to why the kid jumped. What happened when he jumped the fence? I completely forgot for a second. So, if you hear this, then you just we're letting his autoplay. But anyway, there was three variations. Either one, he jumped into the lake. This lake was in front of the school, and I'm pretty sure had alligators. I doubt this one. Two, he ran the fuck home. Honestly, most likely. The third option, he was caught by the go-kart dude that I've seen actually pick up kids that have tried jumping the fence before. Dude has literally snatched children out of the air kind of level. Okay? Anyway, actual bye for now.